Are you looking to restore a Stanley hand plane using an authentic japanned finish? Or repair an old Singer sewing machine to its former glory? Or even fix up a Model T to its original condition using Japan Black? Stay tuned. In this video, we'll look at the ingredients found in some of the more common mixes for Japanning and test 6 different recipes to see which one will work best for me and my projects. Before modern painting methods came along, many manufacturers in the early 20th century, including Ford, Stanley, GE, Singer, and others, used a form of liquid asphalt and baked it on their products. This process was called Japanning. Even though this coating had nothing to do with Japan, makers were looking to imitate the hard, durable, and shiny black finish found on Oriental lacquerware, which itself was derived from lacquer from a tree for centuries. It can be pretty difficult to find some of the old recipes used in Japanning since many were never actually published, but I think we can come pretty close. Most of the early 20th century recipes have 4 primary ingredients: asphaltum, dissolved in a solvent, such as turpentine, naphtha, or mineral spirits, along with a resin or oil, and possibly some drying agents. Let's quickly discuss each of these ingredients. Asphaltum, or asphalt, is a hard, shiny form of solid or semi-solid petroleum and is a naturally occurring substance formed over a long period of time from dead animal or plant material. One particular brand of asphaltum is called gilsonite. In the U.S., gilsonite occurs in parallel, near vertical fractures in only one place, in a basin near the Utah and Colorado border. It was the gilsonite brand that was mixed with other ingredients and then used to paint the Model T cars. Gilsonite appears to have a higher hydrocarbon content than other forms of asphalt, which gives it greater strength and a stronger bond, resisting cracking. You can see that as a powder, gilsonite is brownish black, but it turns dark black and shiny after it's heated. Therefore, if you're testing an old piece you're restoring to see if it was japanned or painted, you can try to rub some polishing compound or cleaner wax on it. If your rag turns brown, it's japanning, or nicotine if it came from a smoker. But if it's black, it's paint. The company I currently get my gilsonite from for these recipes is the American Gilsonite Company in Bonanza, Utah, and you can find them on eBay. The second main ingredient is the solvent, which dissolves the asphaltum. Many solvents have been used in Japanning, including naphtha, mineral spirits, and xylol, but the most common one seems to be turpentine. And by turpentine, I don't mean the turpentine substitute you can find in the hardware stores today. That's not what was used in real Japanning, so please don't use this stuff. Real turpentine, the kind they used at the turn of the 20th century, is made from oleo resin produced by pine trees when they are injured. Workers would, and still do, cut V-shaped streaks on the trunks of these trees to make them bleed the resin. For this reason, real turpentine has a strong pine scent, but fake turpentine usually does not because it's made from crude oil. Turpentine made from pine trees is clear and colorless, but often the big box store turpentine looks like this instead. In the recipes I tested that called for it, I used real turpentine. Turpentine functions as a solvent for hydrocarbons because it too is composed of hydrocarbons. Remember, like dissolves like. The third main ingredient is an oil. Linseed oil, the most common oil found in modern Japanning mixtures, is made from flaxseed and is a plasticizer that keeps the mixture from cracking during heating and helps the surface stay hard but flexible over time. Oils in Japanning were chosen based on how fast they cured or dried and hardened, and if need be, extra ingredients called dryers were added to speed up the process on assembly lines, such as those at the Ford plant. Soluble dryers included small amounts of organic salts of manganese, lead, or cobalt. Incidentally, the boiled part of BLO, or boiled linseed oil, doesn't actually mean that the oil was boiled, but rather that it was heated to about 150 Celsius with small amounts of dryers like cobalt. Double-boiled linseed oil just has twice as much dryer added. I avoided the BLO you can find in the big box stores because it contains impurities, such as proteins from the pressed flaxseed it's made from, that have been known to cause yellowing or promote mildew growth over time. I went instead with a purified, cold-pressed BLO I found online, which is supposedly more resistant to yellowing and includes zinc as the drying agent. The curing of the so-called drying oils is based on cross-linking of the oil's fatty acids with oxygen bridges, which eventually polymerize the oil into the dried finish. Basically, the dryer in the oil transfers oxygen to the oil, which causes it to harden. While this reaction can occur at room temperature, heat speeds it up, helping to cure the oil component more quickly. This is one of the reasons why many restorers bake the Japanning after painting it on, and tweak their heating processes to get good cross-linking. Coincidentally, this same drying process can cause spontaneous ignition because it releases heat when drying, like on rags that are wadded up, which is why you must take great care to air dry materials you use that contained BLO before you throw them away. So let's get to the recipes I tested that contain the ingredients I just reviewed. I found each of these 6 recipes online in forums for restorers who were working on Stanley planes or Singer sewing machines. A couple of these recipes were also tested by Hand Tool Rescue. I'll put the links to their discussions in the description, as well as his video below. Full credit here goes to each of them. Each of the 6 recipes I test are very similar to each other. They just use different percentages and formulations of asphaltum, a solvent, and oil. One popular pre-made mix is made by Liberty on the Hudson, which is called Pontypool Paint Mix. I didn't test or use this product because although they try to keep their recipe somewhat of a secret, I found a couple of sources that say it's just a mixture of asphaltum, xylol, and BLO, which is pretty much the same ingredients I'm already using, but I can make my own mixes much more cheaply. So here's what I did. For the recipes that called for liquid asphaltum, I used a brand called Senefelder's. You can find this product pretty easily online. The MSDS for it, unsurprisingly, says that it's made up of gilsonite and xylol. For the recipes that called for powder, we used a magnetic stirrer to dissolve the gilsonite into the solvent, which was either turpentine or mineral spirits or varnish depending on the recipe. All of the recipe ingredients were added by parts in weight, so a cheap kitchen scale comes in handy here. In a couple of cases, I turned on the hot plate in order to aid in dissolving the asphaltum. If you don't have a magnetic stirrer or hot plate, no worries, you'll just need to stir for longer by hand. After I couldn't get the asphaltum to dissolve much more, I then added the oil. If you add the oil at the start, along with the powder and turpentine, it just gets in the way of the dissolution process, so don't do that. Just let the solvent do its job first and let it dissolve the asphaltum if the recipe calls for the powder form. I then let each mixture sit for 72 hours. If you don't do this, most of the recipes won't have time to thicken up properly. For example, here's mixture A just after mixing, and now 72 hours later. I then took a look at them. Here's the initial results. Recipes A and D showed the most initial promise, as their consistency, which was a thin, cake-like batter, most resembles typical paint, and I believe is what we're looking for. Recipes B and C were pretty thin, and I thought they needed to be thickened up. You can see this because the mixtures just drip right off of the stirrer. Mixtures E and F are entirely too thick. While I was able to fix recipe E by adding additional spar varnish, I could not salvage recipe F. I tried a couple of times to put this recipe together using different techniques, and both times the fact that the oil is not added in right after the gilsonite dissolves in the turpentine doomed any future possibility that it would do so after the initial mix sat for 24 hours. So I'd recommend not allowing gilsonite to just sit in turpentine for too long by itself, because it thickens up in just a couple of hours and really likes to congeal. After making adjustments to the recipes, we wanted to test each mixture's ability to stand vertically before baking, so we got some nails and dipped them in each of the jars. Then we let them sit vertically overnight. The next day, we checked to see how well the recipes stayed put and how they dried. Here's the results of that test. If you're testing recipes, the nail test works well to see how your recipe will hold up to vertical painting. If your mix just slides right off the nail, it will also slide right off the vertical surface of the hand plane you're trying to restore. Next, it was time to do a test paint. I filtered each recipe with a 100 micron filter to make sure I got no lumps or undissolved asphaltum in my paint. I tried several different brushes out for this project. The one I had the best success with is this 1/2-inch mop brush designed for oil paints from Princeton. The test pieces I used were first cleaned with acetone and then heated in the oven to allow for any oils present to dissipate. Please don't forget to off-gas your parts before you paint them. Cleaning with acetone or other degreaser alone will not remove oils buried deep inside the metal you're painting. Other than cleaning with acetone and off-gassing, along with a final wipe with a tack cloth, I didn't concern myself with too much prep on the test pieces, or with the tiny air bubbles that were released while I was brushing, since these are just test runs. I then put a light coat of each recipe on each piece. If you put the coats on too thick, a skin can form on the top of the paint when it's first heated, which will then trap the solvent in the still liquid paint under it and doesn't allow it to completely evaporate. This could lead to wrinkles in your surface finish because different layers will dry at different rates. The Japanning will continue flowing out on its own during heating if it's mixed well. For the recipes that I thought were a little thin, I also painted a vertical surface to see how well the Japanning would hold up and whether or not it would sag. You can see that in my application here of recipe B. I then let each piece sit undisturbed for about an hour to allow the initial leveling process to occur. You can see that even if you apply the paint heavily and horribly like I did here in this example, it smooths out amazingly well. The leveling is an important step, especially if you're brushing. So don't heat the piece right away because you might still see some brush marks in your final finish. Next, it was time to heat up each recipe to the correct temperature. I heated each test piece in an electric oven I use in the garage. I used a dedicated oven thermometer as I never trust the readout on the oven itself. Also, when a recipe calls for baking at 1 hour, make sure that the part you've painted is baking at that temperature for 1 hour, and don't just rely on the oven thermostat itself. It will always take longer for your part to come to temperature. The way I did my heating process was to allow each piece I painted to sit in a cold oven and then come up to the correct temperature for the specified amount of time, and then cool down the same way inside the oven. Again, the gradual heating and cooling here is designed to allow for complete evaporation of the solvent. I also recommend heating in steps, allowing cooling to occur between each higher temperature. So, how did each recipe turn out? Recipe A had a beautiful color and great consistency after mixing. It didn't smooth out as nicely as I had hoped, so I think it needed just a little bit more oil. The finish was just a tad bit grainy and lumpy, but that may mean it's more authentic if that's the look you're going for, especially for things like tools. It just wasn't my taste. A perfectly acceptable and easy recipe to put together, but I like a couple of others a little better. Recipe B was very easy to apply, as it was a thinner mixture and it flowed out very nicely before baking. It gives a bit of a more hammered paint look if that's the look you're going for. But again, this one really isn't my style. Recipe C was the easiest recipe to paint on and extremely forgiving. It maintained its smooth appearance throughout the baking process and turned out to be almost mirror-like shiny. This recipe is perfect if you're looking to restore something like a Singer sewing machine where the Japanning needs to look more perfect. After mixing recipe D, it had a very smooth velvety texture, almost like a thick maple syrup, and it painted on extremely well. Adding the lamp black somehow adds even more darkness to an already black hole of a paint, and just gives more depth to the project. I really like this recipe, and it really does kind of remind me of looking at a Model T. Recipe E was pretty much dead on arrival, even after making adjustments to it. The gilsonite simply could not fully dissolve in the spar varnish. This is because the varnish already has other ingredients in it, like oils and additives, which prevent the gilsonite from completely interacting with just the solvent alone. So, I would not recommend combining powdered asphaltum with spar varnish in any recipe. And then recipe F was not tested as it wasn't a paint. And now for a side-by-side comparison. Ignoring the dust that unfortunately blew onto these pieces during this photo shoot, I think you'll see that the two recipes that stand out from the rest are recipes C and D. But if you like a different recipe better, please be sure to let me know in the comments below. I've given instructions for how to prepare the two winning recipes in the description. Well, that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed this recipe test session. Subscribe now so you don't miss our next video in which we use forged Japanning mixture to restore this 1930s Stanley woodworking vise. Thanks for watching!